Good morning, everybody. I'll invite you to take your seats, please. I hope you're all doing well this morning. Those of you who were getting a bit sick, probably you're recovering, and no other people are getting sick, hopefully. So we are halfway through the conference, a little bit over. So we are, at this point, really want to thank you for being here and participating, and we hope you've had until now and tomorrow too, and perhaps the days after, a really enjoyable time in the conference in the beautiful city of Oaxaca, and that you have found it very productive so far. And before I introduce the plenary speaker for today, I will give again a few announcements. So today we have the last poster session at the same time in the lobby, so it starts at 2:50. We would like you to come and support the poster presenters today. And also to visit the sponsors who are also in the lobby and take some minutes to explore the stands of local artists and local projects that are outside. You will be able to see some very, very nice and creative things. So this is very important. Please take note. Tomorrow, the plenary is a debate, a very, very interesting debate, but it will start 1/2 hour earlier. It will start at 8:30. So the shuttles will also leave earlier at 8 o'clock. The same places. This will be announced on the, however you say it, app. App. So be a few minutes in advance, 5 minutes to 8, 10 minutes to 8, to be able to catch the shuttle and be here at 8:30. The debate tomorrow is going to be about agroecology, what it can do for us, what it can't. So it's very promising. And so I think those are all the announcements, I think. Okay. So now it's my pleasure, really, to introduce this morning's plenary speaker, who is no other than the ATBC's current president, Dr. Juan Manuel Posada. I met Juan probably like 30 years ago, first at St. Louis, Missouri. We were both graduate students. I was visiting St. Louis, and then he actually moved to Florida, and so we both finished there our graduate studies. So I'm really happy to introduce him. I've seen him mostly during the ATBCs. We always meet. So I'll tell you a little bit about him. Dr. Posada is professor at the University of El Rosario in Colombia, and his research has focused on the functional aspects of biodiversity, ecosystem dynamics, and the carbon cycle. And in particular, he uses a combination of techniques to understand how leaf traits relate to ecosystem processes. Dr. Juan Posada has been, for a number of years now, very deeply committed to the ATBC, not only now as current president, but he also was chair of the annual meeting 3 years ago and co-chair of the Neotropical chapter and also council member. Today, in his presidential address, he will take us on a journey to explore how biodiversity credit markets can contribute towards conservation in the tropics, and how, as scientists, we can work with local and original communities to channel resources from the private sectors towards tropical conservation and restoration. So please let us welcome Juan Posada.
Well, I'm gonna turn on this. They gave me this microphone because I like to walk around, and so apparently I look like I'm giving a TED talk. So I'm not used to this. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here and for this invitation. when Helen read my bio, it was clear that this part was not included because this is something new we've been working on, and it's new for not only for our group, but it's also new for most of us because this is a brand new market. So the goal with this presentation is to give you an overview of how biodiversity credits are structured and how they work and how they are linked to the voluntary carbon market too, which is has served as a base. So first of all, well, as we all know, the tropics harbor the richest biodiversity on Earth, so I don't need to explain this to this audience. But at the same time, as we all also well know, that the tropics are under extremely high pressure. This biodiversity is under high risk. And one of these indicators, this is a global indicator of, where's my little hand? Here. Of how biodiversity is one of the indicator of pressure. This is how population size, this global review by the WWF, that how population size has declined globally, and there's declined by 73%. Some groups have declined more, like freshwater species have declined 85%, but terrestrial have declined 69%, and marine populations 56%. So given population size declines are also clearly linked to extinctions, as we all know. The more the population shrink, the higher the risk of extinction. Here's an example from a figure from the ATBC from 2019, where you see the background. Where's my little pointer? I think it's here. Well, there's no pointer, but you see the little background here on from the 1500 to 2018, which is this gray bar, and the cumulative number of species that has gone extinct from these vertebrate groups. So clearly, we're on a path to losing many species. So the beginning of the potential, we're potentially on the 6th mass extinction, which is definitely something we don't want to be. In Latin America and the Caribbean, although this does not include only tropical ecosystem, but a lot of the surface is tropical, there's a very strong decline in population size, up to 95%. And in other parts, just as examples, you see here in Asia, like those from the 1970s, where this same date here, that's why I use it. So you see how habitat loss has been very pronounced in many places in the tropics. So the tropics are definitely also suffering considerable pressure from habitat degradation, as many other places on Earth. What are the threats to biodiversity? Just quickly review it for most of you. There's overexploitation. Well, there's habitat loss. That's probably the biggest one of all. A lot of this habitat loss is driven by beef production. There's overexploitation of species, climate change, which is all of this acts in an interactive way. There's pollution, invasive species, and new diseases or emerging diseases that are spreading. So a lot of pressures on nature. And given this situation, this worry, this concern on our biodiversity, there's a positive outcome of the COP15 that happened in Montreal at the end of 2022, is that we signed what is called the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. That's a landmark agreement with very ambitious targets. And those targets, the first target is to restore at least 30% of degraded ecosystem by 2030. I don't know how close we are to that, probably not that close, but it's still an ambitious target. The third target is to conserve 30% of inland water and marine areas. This is, I think we're getting closer to that target, but we'll have to see the statistics and how close we are. And there are several targets, but one target that is important is if we're going to restore and conserve biodiversity, we'll need resources. We need financial resources. And Target 19, its ambition is to mobilize an additional $200 billion for biodiversity per year by the year 2030, and also encourage leverage from the private sector. And where some of these numbers, this is not exactly the same number, I think, but to give you an idea of how much, what is the financial flow to nature, conservation, restoration? Well, one way of measuring it is through looking at the financial flow to what is called nature-based solution, which is a larger framework that encompasses biodiversity conservation. So a little bit different, but that gives us an idea. The flow, right, according to this calculation from the United Nations, is $200 billion a year. May sound like a lot, That's the economy of some small, medium countries. But if you look at it in the context of the global economy, this is tiny. It's only 0.2% of the global economy. And this flow right now, this 200 billion to nature-based solution, is 82.5% public. That goes mostly to protection of biodiversity and landscapes, and second to sustainable agriculture. And the private investor, which is these orange boxes here on the right, is only 17.5%. And within this private investment, we have a small amount, which is 5.9%, which is, let's see if I can activate this, here, is this little square where you have, in 2023, there was a calculation of biodiversity offset and credits, still very, very small. This is a little bit sad, but at the same time it's encouraging, so I try to see it as an opportunity. But those $200 billion which are invested in nature-based solutions are outweighed, massively outweighed, as the UNEP call it, by $7,000 billion going to investment that have negative effect on nature. So there's a huge imbalance. And the goal is to, this is the current situation, but this is an opportunity because a lot of these investments could be moved to nature-positive effects. So there's a lot of resources that can be moved around. And here, according to UNEP, to meet the Rio targets, nature-based solution should be reached by 2030 here. Well, this doesn't move here. Here. $542 billion. So that's the context. And that's why within Target 19D of the Montreal, the Global Biodiversity Framework, there is a call for the development of biodiversity credits as a tool to help mobilize finance for biodiversity conservation and restoration. It's not the only way we can do it. There are others, but this is one tool, and this is what I'm going to talk about today. There's a projection from this study from the World Economic Forum, and thank you for putting Paramo pictures on the cover. So this was published in 2023, in December, a year after this landmark agreement was attained. And they tried to say, okay, great, we have this, let's look at this new market, the biodiversity credit market, and look what is its potential. So they create three scenarios. One is called limited development, effective, so this is pessimistic, limited development. Effective development is in the middle, and transformational development is like the very optimistic scenario. So, and there's an estimate of how much money could flow to this new market based on these three scenarios. So in the worst case scenario, there will be $1 billion flowing in 2030, $6 billion in 2050, and in the middle one could be $2 billion by 2030, and in the what is called the effective development, and it will be $69 billion in 2050. So this can potentially be a significant contribution to this idea of increasing finance to up to $200 billion a year, additional one, and in the best case scenario, well, it could reach $180 billion. So potentially it can be considerable. So what is a biodiversity credit? This is one thing that is under discussion, but one that has got some traction is by the Biodiversity Credit Alliance. This paper that came out last year. What they say, a biodiversity credit is a certificate that represents a measured, so that's, I highlighted that, you need to measure it, an evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable, so it lasts in time, and is additional to what will have otherwise occur. So it has to be done above. It's something you do additional to the current situation. It's not the business as usual, something new. It is, right now it's voluntary, but it could eventually become mandatory, but we're far from that. It's verifiable and is tradable financial mechanism that brings benefit to biodiversity and its stewards. Biodiversity credits, and that's an important distinction, are not biodiversity offsets. For those of you who don't know biodiversity offsets are mechanisms that exist in countries since the 70s. And they are basically, it's a different system to get money for restoration or conservation. These offsets are designed to compensate for adverse effect of unavoidable impact on project after all effort have been made to avoid and minimize and restore the damage. So basically, it's a case where you build a road, for instance, and you damage some ecosystem. An offset is like you have that hectares you're damaged, that needs to be offset to compensate. You need to have hopefully a very similar ecosystem that you either conserve through the long time or you restore. And it's very regulated. This is something that has very strong regulation, varies by country, and it functions differently. But I want to mention that offsets and credits are not the same. So for those of you who are, I know some of you work on biodiversity credits already, which is great. But I think for many of you, this is something new. And I'm going to explain you briefly, and throughout the talks, how do you build, how do you get biodiversity credits? How do you do that? And you have to build a project. So it's not an NSF project, but you get the idea. You have to build a project. It's more complicated than an NSF project, actually quite more. But it's based on the development of a project. And those projects are the general recommendation for those projects based on the best practices that comes from some of it from the voluntary carbon market, is that when you build your project, you have to select. There are rules how they can build, and the rules and how to construct your project are set by the standards and methodologies. Those are the same. If you want to imagine your NSF rules, and NSF define the rules on how you should build your grant, to get your grant, well, the standards and methodologies are the ones that define it. And there are many different types of standards and methodologies, as you will see. A good project should definitely the good projects have a strong engagement with indigenous and local community, which are usually the stewards of most of the biodiversity on Earth. They need to have integrity and a governance system, so you need to have a structure where you actually operate. That, as a biologist, that causes me headaches. So you need but you definitely need to work. These are complex structure to build. And building your project definitely is an interdisciplinary work for it to be very solid. You also need to think about how you're going to fund it, and how money is going to move within your project and to the community, and you need to have risk management. So, and before explaining you what they are, I also want to tell you what are some of the key differences between the biodiversity credit market and the carbon market. The carbon market has it easier in a way because the carbon market is based on one unit of measure. One credit is 1 ton of CO2 equivalent. That's it, everywhere. So one single minute. So a carbon credit is independent of location. You can trade it. You can get carbon credit from a project in Alaska and one in Amazon, and you can trade those. They are tradable. When they are tradable, there's a term that I learned, called fungible, so that it allows you, like gold is fungible, carbon credits are also fungible, so they are be traded because it's the same. Gold is the same anywhere, and the carbon credits in principle are the same. And the carbon credits can be used for compensation. If you emit here, you can compensate by acquiring carbon credits. But biodiversity, as we all know, is very different. Biodiversity is unique to each site, and it varies along spatial, temporal, and organizational scales. Also, biodiversity can be measured in very different ways. We have a bunch of tools that us as researchers have developed to measure it. We can measure species diversity, and we have a lot of indices to measure species diversity based on taxonomic diversity. We can measure ecosystem diversity, and we can measure functional diversity, which is the one I like. We can also measure phylogenetic diversity, genetic diversity, population diversity. So we have many, many ways of measuring. And depending on the question, the scale we want to work, we will use the right tools. So that's a second aspect. Another distinction that is important with carbon is that, and that's more like my position, I would say, and the people in my lab, is that each individual, and not only, many of you too, is each individual population, species, community, and ecosystem has an intrinsic value. So it's a little bit of a philosophical position, like for a simple fact that when a species exists, an individual exists, it has value. And a species in the tundra is as important as one in a tropical rainforest. So that makes biodiversity something very special. Biodiversity is inherently local. So that makes it different from the carbon. So you have biodiversity in one site is different from the other one. So that makes it not globally fungible. You cannot trade biodiversity and this unless they are extremely similar in the same forest, maybe like project, then you can do it. So in general, it cannot be used it cannot be considered fungible and not used for direct compensation like the biodiversity offset do. But the biodiversity credits are still tradable, and I will show you what's in a very general idea how that works. So just to highlight it, the essence of biodiversity is not to trade biodiversity per se. That's not. I don't think that should be the goal. We're not trading a jaguar by a lion. We're not trading a lion here with a tree. I don't think that should be the way of thinking about it. So biodiversity should be seen as a novel financial mechanism to support biodiversity projects. So that's the way the money will flow to the project. And that project will have positive outcome for nature and its stewards. So it works. This is my super simplified diagram. You have your ecosystem and its stewards, like the local communities or indigenous people. And you build a project with them. Then your project, if everything goes well, your project emits credits. You sell those credits, and the financial flow goes from the people buying those credits back to the project, and then the project is the one managing this money and redistributing it to the local communities and to do the investment needed to conserve nature or to restore nature. And in a way, I also like to think that the biodiversity credit market and the art market shares similar principles. Well, there are a lot of differences, but what happened is like you cannot trade a Picasso by a Monet and say it's the same thing. Okay, so I think for me the same logic applies to biodiversity. You build you build a project around a unique site and another project in another unique site. You cannot really trade those as if they were the same. Each one is unique. So they share this principle of uniqueness and also non-fungibility. So in the next, quite a bit of my talk is going to be dedicated to this and analyzing this, the rules, the standards and methodologies that are being proposed. So what are the different ways that you can develop projects so you can get a sense of what's being emerging. And I also will share some recommendations. So right now, in just 2.5 years, there are 53 methodologies and standards that are either active or under development. There's a firm that calls Bloom Labs that actually are trying to keep track of all of this. And some of what I'm going to show you are data from this database, but also from a couple of analyses from the Biodiversity Credit Alliance, the World Economic Forum, and research papers. And some of these standards and methodologies come from companies like Verra and Gold Standard, which were already in the voluntary carbon market. So, but there are new ones. Like, for instance, the Botanical Garden Conservation International proposed the Global Biodiversity Standard, and the Wallacea Trust is one, or Terrazos, and so there are many, many options available now. And their approach is very, very widely. Those projects, if you want to develop a project, you face to selecting which one of these 53 you want to work with. You know? So that's for problem number one. But then you can also decide what type of project you can develop. You can develop either an uplift project, which is you uplift biodiversity, think about restoration as the most likely scenario. But you can also develop a project that is avoided loss, a project where you actually conserve nature. And there are due distinction done by the Credit Alliance. Avoided loss is when there's an imminent threat to an ecosystem that is very close to be degraded or losing biodiversity, then you call it avoided loss. But if the threats are more distant or very more far away, you can call it maintenance project. So, but the idea is to conserve. So generally there are two, either this uplift or prevent biodiversity from being lost. And there are types of project. Okay, so you let's say you decide to do on one of these two general categories, and then you need to decide on how you're going to measure the outcome. Basically, the outcome is the measure of the difference between the scenario with and without your project activities. So that's an outcome. So your project does something, and that's an outcome. So you can measure that outcome. In general, we will think about going out and measuring biodiversity. This is what is called a biodiversity outcome. which is the result of project activity that demonstrates there's a positive effect on nature, but you actually you have to go and measure it. So, and it's harder to measure, and usually you need to wait a long time to show an effect. It could take decades before biodiversity increases in a restoration project, for instance. So it's better, but it has trade-offs. And there are also outcomes that are based just on the practice. Is you say, I'm doing a management that I know will be beneficial for biodiversity, for instance, and so my management actions are what are called practice outcomes that are much easier to measure, but they're not directly measuring biodiversity. But they have the advantage of they could bring financial flow to a project faster. But so that's, I wanted you to know. So I'm going to talk mostly about the biodiversity outcomes here. And within the biodiversity outcomes, there are two types. There are the ones that are either indirect measure of where you actually go measure something. In the other one, you don't measure ecosystem property directly. But here you get, so if you can do indirect measure, you quantify, for example, things that are affecting the ecosystem and that you're acting on, and you go ahead and measure. One is the reduction of threats that, such as pollutants. Let's say your project is say, I'm going to have a positive effect because my project is going to work on developing a plant, that, like a purification plant, that is going to reduce the amount of pollution to the river, and that's going to have a positive effect. You don't measure the biodiversity, but you measure what you're removing from the ecosystem, such as this threat. That can have advantage in some cases. You can also remove exotic species. That could be your project objective. That will benefit nature, but you don't necessarily measure directly the benefits, just the removal of the threat. And of those different methodologies that are available and the standards, you see that 62% are actually using metrics of ecosystem condition, not directly biodiversity. So they don't require direct measurement of species. So it's more like ecosystem structure or maybe landscape analysis as an example. And the ideal, obviously, the gold standard, if you want, is we go out and we measure biodiversity, as we all know how to do it. We actually quantify species directly. And once we decide to quantify species directly, we can also work on either measuring keystone species. Let's say we have limited resources, we cannot measure everything, obviously we'll never be able, but we can measure key species that are highly indicative. Or at the other extreme, you can measure, let's say you have a big budget, you can measure as many species as you can do, maybe, and there are what are called baskets of metrics. Let's say you measure diversity of vertebrates, plants, birds, plants, frogs, bats. You can measure different groups to get a very broad sense of how biodiversity is positively increasing or being conserved in your project, and you can do a basket of metrics and then you combine them in a single big indicator. Other metrics that are important but are not directly related to biodiversity, but you need to have if you want to have a solid project, is to measure what happens with the indigenous people and local communities. You need, in many projects, you will be working with biodiversity, with local communities or indigenous people, and you have to measure how the project is benefiting them. So you can measure financial flows, the health condition, education, the lower in poverty, and for instance, or decrease in resource extraction from the forest, for instance. So this needs to be taken into consideration. At which scales the projects are developed? So we have all these methodologies, and some say you can claim your biodiversity credits on, you have to use a spatial scale. So you say, most projects say you can claim credits per unit hectare, like happens in other, for instance, in voluntary carbon projects, they use also the hectare to do the calculation. Well, here many use 1 hectare, but since there's so much variability, others use about 35% of those can say you can claim it as low as 100 meters, and one goes as low as 10 square meters. You can claim credits. So, another consideration is project duration. The ideal, those projects should be designed to be very long time, run for a very long time. So they need to be at least 20 years, but there's people that say you should build the projects that last 100 years. So, but this is quite broad, but the idea is to do it the longer, the better. And another key consideration is how you have, let's say you're going to measure biodiversity, but then you need to see how biodiversity is going to change through time. And what you do to do that, this is basically, you should always do it, is you have to define a baseline. So you have to, are like initial conditions for your project. You say, okay, let's say I'm going to do restoration. The baseline is say, okay, I have that many species when I'm starting. And then I'm going to do, I have a reference area where I'm not going to do a restoration project that I compare to. I have the area where I'm going to do my restoration project. I compare, and I can say, okay, these are the conditions here. And then I could either track down both of them, my reference area and my side project, or I could assume that I measure it in the reference area only at the beginning, or my initial condition, and then assume it will stay constant to claim credits. Graphically, it looks a lot more like this. You define your initial condition, which is the point here. The baseline is my point here. Let's say in 2020 here, and then I say, okay, there are projects that allow you to have static baseline. You say, okay, good, you have your initial condition, and you assume it's constant through time. But you also have, and this is what, the blue line is what your project, so your biodiversity goes up in your project, like in 2040, you see it goes up. But it's obviously much better to have a dynamic baseline. If you can actually track down your reference area with your project area, through time is much better. Because the dynamic can be very different. For instance, dynamic baseline 1 could be one scenario, and dynamic baseline 2 could be another scenario. So you will claim more credits, because there's a bigger difference between your dynamic baseline and the project. In the orange, you will claim more biodiversity credits. So this is an area you also need to be careful. And this is a good point by my colleague Mitch, where it's a similar idea. Here you have a baseline that is not a static baseline, the blue line, but is a proposed baseline assuming a business as usual. Let's say biodiversity, this baseline assume that it's a simulated dynamic baseline where you assume that biodiversity, if I don't do anything, is going to decline. But when you actually go and measure your project, is the green line, and the orange is your yellow-orange is the control. The actual amount of credits you can claim actually is much lower. You see the actual additionality here is much smaller than the proposed additionality. So that's something that we need to be very careful, because this can lead to incorrect claims and also ethical questions. Another point that I want to bring here to us and the audience in tropical biology is that many methodologies are based on using, you can compare your project site with your reference site, but you can express it in absolute values, for instance, number of species, but actually most of them, species richness, but most of them actually use relative change differences. So that's, I think, is something we need to understand better, because the relative changes could lead to potential imbalance, because you can have a 30% increase in biodiversity in a project with a low biodiversity, or 30% increase in biodiversity in an ecosystem that is extremely species rich. But on both, you will claim the same number of credits. So there's an unbalance. If doing a potential imbalance, that needs to be more carefully evaluated. That's something we're trying to understand in my lab, because it could be unfavorable for highly diverse communities. Another aspect when you're developing your projects or constructing this project is fundamental to work with indigenous people and local communities. The good projects are actually saying, there are some numbers, I can tell you one that I know, that say that ideally 60% of the credits that your project produces that are sold should go back to the local communities. So it should be reinvested in the local communities. That varies. I still don't have a number of how that can vary throughout the different standards, but the idea is that this should be high. And in the voluntary carbon credit, the good project in voluntary carbon credit pay up to 70% of the carbon credit. There is money that returns to the local communities. To work with the local communities, these are the aspects you need to consider that are important and integral to the project development. You need to understand the land tenure and the legal agreement. You also need to have banking infrastructure to actually move money from the financial system to your local communities. Some people don't even have banks. So how do you move money? You need to think about that. You need to think about risk mitigation. You need to have a governance system that is built by the local communities. Who's going to decide how the money is going to invest in the local communities? You need to think about this and avoid potential issues. You need to diversify income streams within the communities, connect buyers to communities, and also all the time, even before the project starts, you need to work with the community to have free, prior, and informed consent and make them active members of the project. For the project to last 70 years, 100 years, it's a non-trivial problem, but you need to have legal assurances. So you need to make sure that you have legal protection for the long-term run for this. You need to have some level of enforcement capacity. So if it's conserving, for instance, and you need to make sure that you don't lose species. You need to have restriction on the use of natural resources as well. And you need financial assurances. And you need to make sure that there's a flow of income to the project. And one way is to have an endowment fund that support the project. The idea is that those projects will be funded by the biodiversity credits that are sold, but an endowment fund or initial startup investment could help the project get started and run for the first few years. You need to make sure that there are socioeconomic improvements linked to this, and you need to make sure that the nature stewards are key actors in the project development, and you need to have a very effective management system. So as you can see, there's a big structure that needs to go behind on this side. The project integrity is critical also to biodiversity credits. Integrity is transversal, and there are standards and methodology that actually have integrity incorporated into them, and their concern are integrity, but this is something that still needs to be analyzed. And that whoever is buying a credit, you imagine we are buying a credit from a project we think looks great. We want to put a few $100s in this project, but I would like to be confident that I'm helping the right cause. And if a big corporation also wants to buy a bunch of credits, they will need to be like us, be sure that they're buying something that is good quality. Because poorly structured and fraudulent projects affect buyer reputation, cause loss of confidence in the market, and end up also affecting local community, indigenous peoples, and obviously biodiversity. That's why I think this is a good initiative from the Biodiversity Alliance and World Economic Forum and the International Advisory Panel on Biodiversity Credit. Those high-level principles to guide the biodiversity credit market include several of those aspects. This was just published in May. And at last, the last part of this analysis of the standards and methodologies is that the project need to consider what is called leakages. Leakages is where you have, I'll give you an example. Let's say you're going to protect 100 or 1,000 hectares of forest, that's your project. It could be that, okay, you're good at, you protect your 1,000 hectares, but what could happen is that the activities just move outside. So people, instead of cutting on your forest, just keep on cutting, but just on the side. So that's an example of leakage. So leakage is basically project activity that have negative effect outside project boundary. And the way that in the biodiversity credit is being proposed, and there's this review by Washope et al., that you can remove, let's say these are the circle are all the credits that I receive, and the leakage, you basically subtract some of the credits claimed to count for leakage. The other aspect is uncertainty. There's uncertainty, and one way of putting uncertainty in those projects is by putting some credits aside as a risk buffer. So, and the last part of my presentation, which is more brief, is how this links to businesses and financial institutions. There's a special section, and that came from the Global Biodiversity Framework, which is number 15. Reduce businesses' negative impact on biodiversity. This is a clear goal. That's the whole part of the document. And this one encourages government, and I put it in quotes here, to put in place measures to encourage and enable businesses and financial institutions to identify and disclose their dependencies and impact on biodiversity. So there's possible regulation coming out and more pressure coming up on this, and this is mostly, the emphasis is mostly on larger companies, big corporations, because they have also the financial means to actually do that, to actually calculate that. But it also is something that needs to be developed, it's something that works out. Before mentioning you briefly this, what are the motivation that this big corporation could have, according to some recent analysis, is to acquire credits. Why would they buy credits? This is a big, nobody knows right now how many credits, what's the demand for the credits. It's a big open question because it's too new. But some of these motivations that are included are upcoming regulations. So companies might be interested in buying credits because they see there's going to be regulated, they will be early on and be early movers, that could bring them a benefit. They also want to think about their self-preservation because that can affect their supply chain. They want to think about their influence, and also some of them obviously could do it for purely philanthropic reasons. But we have to also understand something, that the businesses face a challenge in measuring and accounting for their impact on biodiversity. How are you going to measure it? There's no agreement on how to measure it right now. And also, we need to work on how the supply chain for a company. Some companies have supply chains, others probably not. Like I think a software company is very different from a company that sells red meat or sells food. But the supply chain can be complex, and how you distribute accountability, responsibility in the supply chain, and how you measure it. So here's an example of supply chain: beef production, the major causer responsible for degradation of habitats globally. The most inefficient way of producing food, by the way, I would think, or one of the most inefficient, beef production. So you have the supply chain has a lot of steps. You have suppliers, you have people producing, raising the animal, then you have companies processing that meat, then packaging it, then distribute it, then there's retail, and then there's the final consumer. So there's a shared responsibility in all this chain, and how do you measure it? And I like this quote, which I thought that was an interesting point. This is from the World Economic Forum. The field of metrics in nature and biodiversity is not new, but it recently moved from primarily academic, so us, so what we do, to a comparative context has exposed it to new challenges. For us in academia, we have access to a wide range of ways to measure biodiversity, depending on our research need, which are great. But for businesses, they have different problems in a way to solve. So they require greater standardization for their monitoring, reporting, and verification. And that greater standardization is also needed for the complexity of the supply chain. So that standardization is required to not only there needs some level of standardization for the companies, but it's also a standardization that is important to link the biodiversity credit market to this monitoring, reporting, and verification. So the companies need clear guidance, which they don't have right now, we'll say, rules that are internationally agreed upon, not yet there, and a fair environment, rules that apply to all, and to be able to showcase outstanding commitment and positive impact. That will not be like serious commitments, no, because most companies will rather avoid being accused of greenwashing than actually doing the greenwashing. So, in conclusion and outlook. Currently, what we see in terms of standardization, we see that standards and methodologies have proposed multiple ways of measuring biodiversity outcomes. So there are all these different ways I can measure directly biodiversity with keystone species. So there's all these multiple ways of doing it. But there's a call, really, what I do is a call for looking for. It's okay to have many ways of measuring nature, that's great, but we need some level of standardization. We need to have at least something that is standard to disagree upon for the standards, the methodology, and also for the companies that is measured everywhere. So it could be something relatively simple, but we need to agree because we cannot do super expensive measurements everywhere, but something relatively simple that can be done throughout. And so hopefully we can get there relatively quickly. And We also need, in terms of standardization, we also need to formally evaluate these different metrics. For instance, the percent versus absolute change. So we need, as academics, I would say, to get involved in this analysis. There's also a need for, and it's clear for me, given the complexity of this market, which is, and all these standards, and all these different ways of measuring biodiversity, I think it's clear that we need a third-party, global, multifactorial ratings of standards. So we need to be able to analyze those standards, so in a way that is relatively easy to present. Let's call it like the standard of and Poor's of biodiversity, okay, if you want. But, well, not, I have my reserve about that, but maybe someone who can give you another name, but a much better name. But this is necessary, not only for the standards and methodology, but also for the projects. If we have ways, in the carbon credits, there are also several companies doing that, but we need to have ways to measure the quality of projects, yes, and those standard methodology. This is my personal invention, so you could do a radar. That's how I was imagining it. You measure like several aspects of the biodiversity of your project, like number of taxa you're measuring, your data quality. If you measure ecosystem property, how good is your baseline? How's your sampling frequency? That could be a way of evaluating projects, just thinking out loud. But you also have another where you actually measure all the social aspect to the project, like the clear participation of the indigenous and local community, the legal structure, the financial governance and management, and try to do a composite effect. So another aspect that is important is the funding for projects. So we need high quality, the high quality conservation project costs money, so we need to have hopefully either private or public funds to support the development of this project, because if we have more money, we can do much better projects. And almost finishing, in terms of monitoring, which is important for us potentially, given that if this market grows as expected, that will mean an increased demand for expert knowledge, many of us, a strength in museum collection also, because there will be a enormous flow of biodiversity monitoring. That I think could be a positive for a museum collection, and that should be strengthened. I think it's also an opportunity for an open access data repository to enhance project transparency. And also it's obviously an opportunity if there's some level of standardization and this data are stored in big servers, to expand our knowledge on biodiversity. The monitoring should be, there's all this new technology, many of us working on it, that are key and are already key to actually monitor biodiversity in a cost-effective manner. That could be an important way of supporting the monitoring of biodiversity within the frame of these projects. But we need to support the ongoing development of this technology, the data processing and calibration, for it to be an ongoing success. But without forgetting that this new technology complements traditional monitoring approach, and the traditional monitoring approach are key for building this and developing these technologies. And there's also a recommendation that indigenous people should also be involved in the monitoring, both either them measuring directly or also developing their own ways based on their own values and culture of quantifying that diversity. And so my last slide is the biodiversity credit market has then the potential to bring a lot of resources to the conservation and restoration of biodiversity, while at the same time supporting indigenous people and local community, but it's still in a very initial stage. There's a lot of things that could happen. It could go bad or could good, but it's developing very rapidly. And the framework that will define its future is being constructed right now, so as we speak. So this is also an invitation for you to, hopefully I gave you a sense of how the projects are structured, and it's an invitation to be actively involved to ensure that there's rigorous scientific foundation for this market and to guarantee that the tropics are well represented. So last slides, I want to thank Paola Mateos for helping in this analysis, and Jorge Marin for discussion, also Viso Consultores for some initial analysis, and Universidad del Rosario and Terra Spectrum for funding. Thank you.
Micrófono. Oops. Thank you, Juan. We have a few minutes for questions. I would like you to be short, brief, so we can have more interventions. With the terracotta kind of color dress, and then...
Thank you so much for this amazing talk.
Thank you.
My question, you kind of briefly mentioned it already. So one of the main benefits to local people are financial flows, given that they already have rights to land and mechanisms to receive those finances. But is there an opportunity for indigenous people to request benefits on their own terms? For example, So it's not just a financial metric, but other things that actually secure their rights to their land and other...
Yeah, I think that was the ideal. And I've seen projects in the... I got interested in this, actually, because I saw a project in the voluntary carbon market that is, I think it seems to be working quite well. And the indigenous people decide themselves, they receive millions of dollars from the carbon credits. And then they decide themselves how they're going to use it. They decide, they have their own meeting with their own way of actually reaching an agreement. And once they actually declare that agreement, there's a little legal mechanism for them to say, this is what we want. We want to buy like an ambulance boat, for instance, is something they did. And then once that agreement is reached, the money is released from the bank and it reaches their, so that's the idea. I don't know if I answered your question, but yeah, that's the idea.
Thank you.
But it's difficult to make it work right. So that's, it has to be carefully constructed. Yeah.
Sorry, we have one here, then one over there. And I think that's going to be it, but Juan is going to be around. So
I will be around.
Filippo?
Juan is here. Yeah, the question. Thank you. I was already very keen on the biodiversity credit idea for conserving the existing part. After your talk, I'm even more. So thank you for the very nice clarification on that issues. I have a small technical issue, and I think very often you want to conserve what you have because it's very good.
Yes.
And the comparison will be, I believe, with a degraded place next door, let's say.
Yes.
So then you will have basically, if you do the right thing, you will keep the two lines parallel, or even worse, that the degraded one was getting even worse.
Yes.
So how would you be, it looked like it doesn't change, but nothing changes good in this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So the credit will be measured as a difference between the two, or whatever measure we do, over time, that it will be always or similar or even a little more. But it doesn't need to increase, right?
So the question is, I'm not sure I understand.
Sorry, the question would be, it cannot potentially not increasing over time the difference between the two sides, the one you're conserving, keeping as it is, and the one that is already degraded. So there will be constant, but that will be still a good measure.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can claim, that's a good point. So you can have like, your conserved side that has high diversity, your degraded side also low diversity and stays constant, absolutely. And because those projects, at least the one I know, they claim it. You can claim it every year or every 5 years. You can claim credits based on how this difference is maintained. Exactly. Thanks.
Thank you, Juan, for the presentation and for the masterclass on this. But I'm worried, to be honest, on this, because I would like to know I have many questions, but I would like to know what are the lessons being learned from the carbon, what are the lessons being taken from the carbon markets, from successes and the many failures for the on biodiversity credits. I'm pointing this out because, what is going on with indigenous communities and local people at the Amazon at this moment is like Far West cowboy kind of situation, Mm-hmm. There are no rights being respected. They wake up and there is a carbon market in their indigenous land. They didn't know about it. There are many, many, many issues related to that. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And, are we going to put, and just the way of how to engage them with a different cosmovision to put a value on something that they don't see as a part of themselves, which is biodiversity. I find it very difficult.
I fully agree, and that's why I insisted in this presentation on the local community, indigenous people, and that's something that this is a lesson that was learned from the voluntary carbon market, because in the past the market was very informal and it was poorly structured, and there were bad actors that entered, and actually, like their example in many places, not only Brazil but in Asia also, where someone came and developed a carbon project, but gave like just a few textbooks to the local communities and asked them to sign a piece of paper. They didn't know what they were signing. And this person claimed, or this group claimed, all the credits disappear, and the community just kept on doing what they were doing, and their forest actually kept degrading. So this is the kind of things that need to be avoided, and that's And that's clear. This is a lesson that I think that was clearly learned in the credit market, in the carbon credit market, and that's why all these documents on integrity and that's why there's so much efforts being put on that, making sure local communities and indigenous people are including from the beginning, and that they understand what they're getting into it, and if they don't want to be involved in it, they can totally reject it. So. That's where building this project needs to have. You need to have an interdisciplinary team. You need to have anthropologists. The successful project I know has a very strong anthropologist behind it that has worked with the communities for 10, 20 years. So they have a close link, so they could build something following the cosmovision. So, but that's how it should be done. Yeah, but that's a cause of concern, obviously, when it's poorly done.
Thank you. We have one last question over here.
Okay. Juan,
thank
you for your wonderful talk. And you are talking about projects that may last for 20 years or even more, up to 100 years.
Yeah.
And you mentioned about how we can harness technology in monitoring those projects. Yeah. Any thought about how AI will be used in this new era?
AI?
Yes.
Yeah. There's a lot of these new technologies. They need to use AI to process the data. For instance, by acoustics, you have this recording, and there are people here I can talk about it in a lot more detail than I do, but you have these recordings of every sound, but then with AI, you can train an AI agent to actually identify within this enormous data set specific sounds to look for it. So you need to have those machine learning algorithms to. So this is critically important because the volume of data is enormous that is generated, and AI is one of the tools that we can actually make sense of it. Yeah.
Thank you. We don't have more time for questions, and I saw many hands raised, so please approach Juan. I'm sure he's happy to talk to you.
Yeah.
And just let's thank him very much for this beautiful.
Thank you. Ay, gracias.
Muchas gracias.